Hello again. I was just telling everybody else on the social media platforms, um, I'm doing really good for my age, considering I'm almost 40. I've had a bunch of injuries, I've had a few surgeries. I'm small. I was not a large child, I'm not a big person as an adult. And I got picked on and bullied. Uh, had to fight a lot just to defend myself and stand up for myself. Um, and so I got hurt, training. I got hurt wrestling in middle school and high school. Hurt my back to where my neck was stuck looking, my chin towards my right shoulder. And I had to do yoga to get my mobility back, and it did work eventually. Um, and it was difficult. It was very difficult. I started doing yoga when I got hurt from that wrestling injury. And also before that, I started doing yoga on the swim team. Swim team coach, I think it was a lesbian couple. They were really cool. And they would have us do yoga before or after swim practice. And I started doing it at home. And my parents didn't approve. They're like very conservative and scared of anything different. So they just assume that yoga's the devil if you're going to let demons into your body bending over like that, which is crazy, right? But that's what they believed. And to them, it was a very real, scary thing. So I did yoga in secret in my room. I did martial arts growing up, wrestling, karate, boxing with my dad. I learned some joint manipulations, the way that the fingers are supposed to go and not supposed to go. Um, and so, uh, I got older, I went to the military, I got disillusioned, and I became a yoga teacher and traveled around, and I ended up here in Tallahassee. And my whole life, I've been developing this daily routine, imitating the warrior monks, um, imitating, you know, the Buddhist monks and the full-time martial artists, the fighters. And I don't think of myself as an MMA fighter. I don't think of myself as a UFC fighter. Um, I am a yoga teacher who does martial arts. I am a cook who does martial arts. I would like to be this well rounded person who is a chef and a martial arts teacher and a yoga teacher, but all I've been able to do so far is become a yoga teacher. So I train as if I were a soldier or a martial artist because I read a really good book called Ultimate MMA Conditioning a long time ago. Um, and it was really good. And I stick with that routine where I'll do 2 months of endurance, I'll do 2 months of strength training, 2 months of strength endurance, and then 2 months of explosive speed and strength. And then I'll go on from there the rest of the year and put them together. Right now, I'm doing 2 months of endurance while I rehab a sprained ankle. So, yeah, we're about to get started. I'll just jump in and sit down. But I was just laying out what I do and why. Um, I got into swimming and surfing and wrestling when I was a kid. I was super active. And the yoga helped me so much, but I wasn't allowed to do it. And I've been wanting to share it with the world my whole life. And I spent a few years teaching yoga. Um, and so I got some good time in, distributing the art. And I need to continue to do that. So, yeah, I'm working on, deepening my reading, deepening my meditation, my martial arts, my yoga practice. So right now I'm practicing Wing Chun. These medals come from Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and from grappling tournaments in general. Submission grappling, I'm not about wrestling, I'm about going for the submission in the martial arts. But now I'm training Wing Chun because I'm getting a little older and it's safer. And it's compatible with things I've done in the past. It's compatible with Tai Chi. I did praying mantis kung fu in the past. It's compatible with that because it focuses on Buddhism and Taoism. So yeah, I'm very happy right now, and I want to share this routine I've developed for myself with you, and encourage you to develop a daily routine where you sit down to read, to meditate, and then you get up and do martial arts, warm up, and do some yoga or some stretches, you know. And whether you just sit down and study and then work out and stretch, that's a great routine too. And if I call it that, it might be more appealing to people. So yeah, study, exercise, stretch, right? Just layman's terms for those things. But I'll shut up now and we'll begin. And, you know, I believe in presenting myself as human and not trying to pretend I'm something I'm not. I've got a little belly, I've got a little muffin top. I'm in pretty good shape though. I've got my little vapes here. These are THC vapes from the store. I like cannabis. I'm not on probation anymore. Probation is finally over from when I was a political prisoner. And I'm going to do what I've been doing, which is go set up a table, you know, might attend some protests, but I have to be very careful. And my main goal right now is just to distribute this communist newspaper because it's very well done and well thought out and professional. And that is from the Revolutionary Communists of America. I'm not a member, mainly because they told me they don't want me to be. But I think it's because of my past with the YPG, and because my current views are not sufficiently developed enough yet. So yeah, I've been talking for 7 minutes. So again, I've got my pre-workout drink over there in the bottle, and I've got my little vape here, and I've had an edible gummy earlier. So, you know, these things help us a lot just to get through the day and the night. And if you gotta have like a ton of cushions and a heating pad and, you know, a video to watch or a vape or a coffee or some pre-workout or caffeine tea, whatever you gotta do to get yourself to sit down and practice, do that, because it's worth the trouble to get you to practice. I found one good mindset for me is that everything in my life should revolve around getting me to practice.
This is Michael Perini, and welcome to Real History, a series of talks by me on different historical subjects that are relevant for understanding today's realities. Most people are never exposed to real history. In school, we usually don't read history. We read history textbooks, and mainstream ones at that, which avoid underlying realities and ones that propagate myths, myths that serve the powers that be, myths that some of us find harmful to the truth and to democracy. So this is real history. This particular segment is entitled The Functions of Fascism. Fascism is a name that was given to the political movement that arose in Italy under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, who ruled that country from 1922 to 1943. Nazism, a similar movement led by Adolf Hitler, was Germany's dictator from 1933 to 45. It's considered by most observers to be a variant of fascism, as to a lesser degree is the militaristic government that controlled Japan from 1940 to 45, and the Falangist movement led by Francisco Franco in Spain their democratic roots by overthrowing communism. You might recall that they weren't democratic before communism came in. They were fascist. And in fact, several of those countries, with the exception of Poland, were open allies of the Nazis. They were Nazi fascist allies. Now, like with a lot of terms, like liberalism, democracy, socialism, communism, no single definition of fascism maybe will satisfy everybody. And with fascism, there's a really special problem because it's a beguiling mix of revolutionary-sounding mass appeals and reactionary class politics. And the reactionary class politics are the part of fascism that our establishment historians almost never talk about. Hitler's party, for instance, was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or Nazis. It's a very left-sounding name, National Socialist German Workers, and it was designed to win broad support among working people, even while the Nazis were destroying working-class organizations. In other words, fascism, and the original Italian and German variations of fascism, was a political phenomenon that made a revolutionary appeal without making a revolution. It promised to solve the ills of the many while in fact protecting the special interests of the few with violence and terror. And it propagated a new political consciousness, a new order, a new nation to serve the same old capitalist system. Let me run down a couple of the major characteristics of the fascist ideology. First, there's a glorification of the leadership cult, a commitment to an absolutist and supreme leader, all-knowing and all-guiding, the Führerprinzip, as it's called, the Führer principle, the leader principle, I should say. Second, there's a glorification of the nation-state as an end in itself, as an entity unto itself, an absolute component to which the individual is subsumed. Everything in the state, everything for the state, nothing outside of the state. That was Mussolini's dictum, and it was Hitler's also. In fact, with Hitler, Rudolf Hess once said, Adolf Hitler is Germany, Germany is Adolf Hitler, therefore combining both the leadership cult and the state cult into one. Third, there was a glorification of military conquest and jingoism, a glory of that the state is vitalized by subduing, conquering, taking other people, enslaving them. You increase your own power and your own glory. Fourth, there was the propagation of a folk mysticism, a xenophobia, and a racism. The Nazi slogan was Eine Volk, eine Reich, eine Führer. One people, one state, one leader. Also, as a other side of the folk mysticism, this blood cult of the special blood, the special legacy, the atavistic wonders of our particular people was as I say, xenophobia, a hatred, and racism, a hatred of other peoples, other nationalities. With the Nazis and with most other Eastern European fascists, it was anti-Semitism. The Jew was seen as the perpetrator of all that was ill in society. The trade unionists, they were Jews, the communists, so forth and so on. And behind them stood this wicked, alien-blooded creature who would undermine our state. Fifth, there was an opposition, both in Italian fascism and in German Nazism, an opposition to socialism, to communism, to anarchism, and to all left egalitarian class movements and doctrines, along with opposition to trade unions, opposition to labor parties, opposition to other working class political organizations. Of these various characteristics of Nazism, 1, 2, 3, 4 are often talked about by established historians, mainstream historians. That last one, though, opposition to labor unions, opposition to working class parties, opposition to socialism and such, that one is never talked about by Western writers, especially American writers. The historians and the political scientists and the journalists who treat the subject of fascism usually write from a centrist ideological perspective, from the political center of the spectrum, which means they usually ignore the link between fascism and capitalism, just as they tend to ignore the entire subject of capitalism itself when there's something unfavorable to say about it. Instead, they dwell on the more phantasmic components of fascist ideology, the nihilistic revolt against Western nationalism and individuality, the irrational appeals to mass submission to a leader and all that. extremely so. But the government wasn't totally free to apply these harsh measures. First of all, Italian workers and peasants had their own unions, they had political organizations, they had cooperatives, they had their own publications, and through the use of demonstrations and strikes, boycotts, factory takeovers, occupying farmlands, the forcible occupation of farmlands, they often won some very real concessions in wages and work conditions, unemployment benefits, and they won the right to organize. And even in the face of this worsening economic crisis, they were able to mount a troublesome defense of their standard of living. I mean, troublesome for those who own the land, the labor, and the capital, and the money in the banks, and the farms, and the factories. So the only solution really was to smash the worker and peasant organizations, in effect destroying all political and civil liberties, including the right to organize, agitate, and propagandize. The state would have to be more authoritarian and more firmly subservient to the interests of capital. Mussolini and his black shirts were around right after World War I, and through for about 3 or 4 years, the big landowners and industrialists used their fascist goon squads, gave them money and gave them arms, and used them as kind of strike breakers, anti-labor militias. They styled themselves the United Front Against Bolshevism. In 1922, the big capital interests in Italy decided to go for the whole thing. Representatives of the Federation of Industry and the Federation of Agriculture, which was a agribusiness firm, and representatives of the National Banking Association, they all met together, and they met with Mussolini, and they planned the fascist march on Rome. Mussolini sat there and planned that with the leading capitalists of Italy. By the way, this is almost never mentioned in the accounts about the march on Rome. These big capitalists contributed 20 million lira toward that undertaking. In the words of Senator Ettore Conti, himself a very loyal representative of the money interests, quote, Mussolini was the candidate of the plutocracy, this is the wealthy, and the business associations. A very similar pattern, by the way, of coordination and compliance existed in Germany also, less than a decade later. German workers and farm laborers in the period following World War I under the Weimar Republic won some important economic concessions. They won an 8-hour day, they won unemployment insurance, they were able to elect shop committees, and they won the right to unionize. And again, during the 1920s, these paramilitary right-wing gangs, most notably Hitler's brown shirts, stormtroopers, were subsidized by business in a limited way and kept as a kind of reserve army with Gouraud, the bodyguard of capitalism. And their job again was to strike, break, and to harass organized workers and to beat up socialists and communists and such. The nearly total collapse of the German economy in 1929-30 presented the owning class with a momentous crisis. They had very big capital investments, and these left them with very high fixed costs that had to be met even as their plants lay idle. Only massive state aid could revive their profits. Wages and social welfare, human service expenditures had to be cut. Union contracts had to be abrogated. In fact, human contracts had to be abrogated too. Business would need new subsidies and tax exemptions. The crisis in agriculture was equally severe, and the large landed proprietors, the Junker class, demanded even higher subsidies, heavier duties on foreign agricultural imports, and an end to farm unions. These unions were holding wages up, and when wages were being sustained, you cut into profits. So by 1930, most of the influential landowners and big industrialists and bankers, especially the industrialists in steel, coal, and mining, had concluded that the Weimar Republic no longer served their interests, and no longer could protect their class, and that it was too accommodating to the working class and to certain sectors of light industry. So they greatly increased their subsidies to Hitler, and they propelled the Nazi Party onto the national stage. By 1930, most of the great industrialists and bankers were underwriting the Nazi Party. And what happened in 1930 with this injection of hundreds of millions of marks is that Hitler was able to catapult his party onto the national scene. It went from a foreign countries. And the genuineness, by the way, of fascism hatred of workers and foreigners was never open to doubt, so they fit in quite snugly. Now, I don't mean to say that all the big industrialists and financiers supported fascism with equal fervor. Some, like Tyson, were early and enthusiastic backers of Hitler. The aged Emil Kerdorf thanked God that he lived long enough to see the Fuhrer emerge as the savior of Germany. Others contributed money to the Nazis, but also to other anti-socialist parties on the right. They backed Hitler only when he promised to be the best hope for their interests. By the way, many of them still remain privately critical of the more extreme expressions of Nazi propaganda, and they were a little uneasy about the anti-bourgeois rhetoric that is sometimes used by some of the fascist plebeian elements. Some elements of business were not that hot for fascism. Light industry, which had lower fixed costs and more stable profits than heavy industry that was dependent on consumer buying power and such. The light industrialists were not that keen about a more aggressive foreign policy, about heavy subsidies to heavy industry and the like. But when push came to shove, they may not have been close to the fascists, but they weren't about to ally themselves with the proletariat against the business class, of which they were a part, and they pretty much sided with the dominant elements or kept their mouths shut. There was another element in these two societies that not only tolerated the rise of fascism, but supported it. And I'm talking about the parliamentary capitalist state itself, not the government or the parliament as such, but the instruments of the state, the instruments that have the legal monopoly on force and violence, the police, the army, the courts, and the like, the secret intelligence agencies and such. In both Italy and Germany, years before Mussolini and Hitler emerged victorious, these elements, courts, police, the army, showed a real leniency and open collaboration with fascism, while harshly repressing the left. Mussolini and Hitler could not have come to power without the help of the state machineries, and that state machinery was never really against them. In Italy, the police collaborated with the fascists in attacking labor and peasant organizations. They recruited criminals for the fascist action squads, these they call squadristi. Um, they promised them immunity from prosecution for past crimes. When applications for gun permits were regularly denied to workers and peasants, police guns and police cars were made available to Mussolini's goons. Germany, the same kind of thing went on. Immediately after the war, the military police and the judiciary sided with the rightists to suppress the left, a pattern of collaboration that continued to the day that Hitler took power. In other words, these supposed democracies, which were equally opposed to totalitarianism of the left and the right, were not equally opposed. They were opposed to the left, and they were very close and comfy with the right. Because the right, while it was out to destroy that democracy, the right was protecting the interests of property and the existing class structure. And that's the difference between the left and the right. And that's why a capitalist state tends to treat the right so much more leniently and the left so much more harshly. Let's look at what happened by the police and the courts under the Weimar Republic. These are the figures. Left-wing groups were charged with 22 murders. 38 people on the left were found guilty for those 28 murders. They averaged 15 years in prison. 10 of those 38 were executed. Among right-wing groups, 354 murders. What is that? That's about 50 times, 60 times more the number of murders. Of these 354 murders, 326 were not even prosecuted. 23 were discharged. 23 people of the right-wing groups were discharged despite entering guilty pleas. They pleaded guilty to the murder and they were discharged. 24 were found guilty in part. Their average term in prison, 4 months. The number of them executed for the murders, none. So that's the way the state operated. Almost all the literature on fascism and Nazism concentrates on who supported Hitler, who supported Mussolini, who was behind him. Was it this group or that group, and such. Oh, there was a couple of millionaires who didn't like them. Oh, there were some workers who did vote for them. So you can't really say it's one class or another. Well, I think you could pretty well say which class gave them the money, that gave them the visibility of the organization and the numbers to some degree. But there's something else. Besides talking about who supported fascism, one thing these historians regulations, including fines, dismissals, and imprisonments against workers who agitated or complained of shop conditions. I mean, even a Nazi labor front newspaper had to admit, quote, some shop regulations are reminiscent of penal codes. Workers no longer had the right to change jobs. They could be shifted from one employment to another regardless of their wishes. They could be conscripted for any work assumed useful to the nation's economy without guarantee of wages equal to previous earnings. In both Italy and Germany, the government exercised compulsory arbitration and regulation of work and wages. By the way, any worker who contested that would be contesting the laws of the state and therefore would be declared an enemy of the state, not just in conflict with management, but an enemy of the state. So, in effect, what you got was a perfect wedding of the interests of the state and the interests of the capitalist class in this particular capitalist state. And by the way, these measures had their effect, according to figures supplied by the Italian press itself. The already meager wages, the wages weren't all that good to begin with, for Italian workers in 1927 were cut in half by 1932. By 1939, the cost of living had risen 30%, and this constituted an additional decrease in real wages. Taxes on wages were introduced. Regulations were instated against minimum wages. Minimum wage law was abolished, in other words. There was no more increased pay for overtime. In some regions, sanitary and safety regulations were dropped. Occupational safety regulations were eliminated in factories. In many areas, child labor was reintroduced. In other words, all the old abuses and old evils that the Italians thought were dead, that belonged to a generation ago, had returned under fascism. In Germany, the same story. Between 1933 and 1935, wages were lowered anywhere from 25 to 40%. That's a tremendous cut if you're an ordinary worker just trying to make ends meet. Wage taxes were instituted. Municipal poll taxes were doubled. Payroll deductions helped finance the Nazi-controlled Labor Front. And the Nazi Labor Front controlled the party organizations and the health and unemployment insurances, all of which, by the way, lowered wages to the 20 and 30%. That is, the things that were taken out of your pay for that. And the non-profit mutual assistance and insurance associations that had existed before the Nazis came to power, when the free labor unions were abolished. Their funds were taken over by private insurance companies that charged more while paying out smaller benefits. So, and in Italy, in Germany, just like in Italy, inflation substantially added to the German workers' hardship. There's something else both of these fascist leaders did. In both Italy and Germany, the process of privatization. Does that sound familiar? Ronald Reagan's dream. State-owned enterprises such as power plants, steel mills, banks, railways, insurance firms, steamship companies, and shipyards were handed over to private ownership for a song, like gifts. Corporate taxes were reduced by half in both Italy and Germany. Does that sound familiar? Another Reagan achievement. Taxes on luxury items for the rich were cut. And inheritance taxes were either drastically lowered or abolished, just as they've been the last 10 years in America. In Germany, between 1934 and 1940, the average net income of corporate businessmen rose by 46%. Enterprises that were floundering were refloated with state bonds. They were recapitalized out of the state treasury, and they were returned to private control and solvent. So you see, these are people who say socialism doesn't work, but when capitalist businesses start to fail, they go socialist. They take the money out of the public treasure and refloat these businesses. made references to Reagan and Reaganism. I didn't mean to imply that Reagan was a fascist. In fact, quite the opposite. I meant to point out that in the American context, Reaganism meant the same crisis that was going on, a similar crisis. It wasn't quite the same, but accomplished the same things within the existing framework of the political framework of the existing political system. He broke unions, but he didn't use death squads and terror squads. He broke them using consultation corporations, advisory corporations, spending hundreds of millions of dollars showing companies how to break unions. They broke unions by instituting one of the most restrictive and prohibitive and difficult laws, the Taft-Hartley law, that goes back to 1940s, which make union organizing in America so very difficult. They've tried a number of times to limit our constitutional rights, the rights of free speech, the right of government accountability. They've cut inheritance taxes. They've cut the capital gains taxes. They've cut corporate taxes. They've abolished the progressive income tax. These are the accomplishments of the Ronald Reagan administration. While everyone talked about what a nitwit and a dingbat and a fool he was, Ronald Reagan did some very successful and brilliant things for his class. He rolled back the social democracy that had been developing in the late 60s through the 70s. He cut back undermined human services. He staffed agencies and courts with people in government who do not believe in government and do not even carry out the programs that Congress voted in. So within the American context, he's done quite a few things, short of course, what Hitler and Mussolini did as a final solution. And today I would also point out that in capitalist democracies, both in Europe and in the United States, the security forces have that same double standard that we discovered in Italy and in the Weimar Republic in Germany. Namely, they look the other way toward violence from the right, or seem to do very little, or seem so seldom able to capture the perpetrators, unless the perpetrators are so crazy as to attack and kill police themselves. Then they go after them. But on the left, there's a constant surveillance, harassment, and in fact, sometimes outright murder. One can think of the systematic murder of the Black Panther Party, something like 30 of them killed in coordinated police attacks in cities throughout America. Or one can think of what's going on in West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Portugal today, where people on the left are being thrown in jail for astronomical sentences, while terrorists on the right seem to get by and get away with murder. Well, this is what we have to look at, and we have to understand that fascism is not just another ism out there. It's not just an aberration. It has a very rational side to it. It's a rational, functional form, and it can take diluted forms. And its propensities, its proclivities can exist even in the democratic state. That is, within that state, those police powers and those state powers can manifest some of the very same symptoms and all the worst attributes that you might find in a Nazi Germany or fascist Italy. Don't take my word for it. Just ask the CIA. Thank you. This is Michael Parenti with some real history.
So that was just the reading. Now I'm going to sit to meditate. And, you know, I get a lot of feedback from people who don't train, or people who do train and they have the wrong impression of me. I'm not trying to be like the best fighter in the world. I'm not trying to be some kind of militant leader or anything like that. I'm not trying to be better than anyone, and I don't think that I am better than anyone at anything. I'm just trying to survive while also living a meaningful life and feeling good. And I want to balance that with being strong enough to help myself and other people. So that's why I love martial arts. But yeah, I'll shut up. We're switching over to the meditation. And for me, I like to watch video of the things that I'm learning when I meditate. So I'll either like just gaze at an image of the Buddha, or which is a meditation, or I will put on a video of a guided meditation, or I will watch a video of someone doing beautiful Tai Chi over and over. Or right now, I'm learning Wing Chun. I'm learning certain dishes in my job as a cook. So I'll watch videos of that on a playlist on repeat. So that way I can get some mental repetitions in. So that's what I'm about to do right now. So this will be a little quieter than the reading section. I've got my little meditation beads with me today. And you just touch one bead next to the head bead for one breath. And then after you begin to inhale the next breath, you touch the next bead, and so on. Try to breathe slowly and then relax. The point is just to be aware of the breath while you're sitting and have relaxed, focused awareness.
I forgot to tell you that I got you like 2 different kinds of vegan protein
Thank you.
to munch on, but yeah, that's it. Sorry.
I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. I love you.
Love you too. Two different kinds of vegan protein.
said, was doing some other things too. He started copying the left agenda to a limited degree, not with the same egalitarian, but he set up education programs, he trained cadres of engineers, he put in public health programs, a number of things like this. There are many countries in the Middle East that have oil with no water. There are others that have water and no oil. Iraq was the only one that had both. It was a blood thing. Yugoslavia did too. It was destroyed by the Mediterranean, the bombing, which many of our progressive and liberals supported, the bombings against Yugoslavia. In Iraq too, the same thing has happened. There's a very good agricultural base which has been destroyed by the Mediterranean war in consideration. I mean, what evil is this? How broadly do you define your own interests, and how narrowly do you define other people's interests? That you can poison them and destroy them unless you gain some advantage for yourself, real or imagined. So Iraq has the highest standard of living in the Middle East, which isn't saying too much, but it wasn't that bad. War does some other things too. War also has domestic political benefits. War makes you a leader, a great hero. You know, we know some of our compatriots, don't we? We know some of our fellow Americans who never stop saying, quite capable of saying cynical things. Politicians, they say one thing to you to get elected, and they do something else when they're in office. They talk to the little guy, but they end up helping the fat cats. I mean, you get people say that. But when those same politicians wrap themselves around the flag, and when they point to some evil out there, some threat that's going to come get you, why, then our same compatriots suddenly discard their cynicism, discard their skepticism, and with childlike trust, they say, we've got to support the president. We've got to support the president. You know, I heard a student once say to me, he said, that's the difference between you and me. He said, I have faith in President Bush. He was talking about George the First. He said, I have faith. I said, excuse me? You have faith in the president? What are we doing here, religion or politics? You have faith in George Bush? Like my Italian grandma had faith in St. Anthony? You have a picture of Bush on your bureau with a little candle, you light it, you go, oh, Madonna, George Bush. He said, well, I trust the president. I said, there too, you trust the president? Trust that we're dealing with here? Trust which is something that you should reserve only for your friends and close companions or close family members, and even then check them all out once in a while, right? You're all laughing, you know, right? No, democracy is not about trust. Democracy is about distrust. It's about accountability. It's about exposure. It's about debate. It's about getting the things out on the table. It's about challenging them. That's what it's about. In 1907, this is what Woodrow Wilson said. 1907. This was, I don't even think he was yet governor of New Jersey. Well, he certainly wasn't president. Maybe he was governor.
So this is traditional Wing Chun forms, library of techniques.
out there hoping to find it. That's Marx, they say. And I said, boy, this guy Marx was really something. You know, here I am. I'm knocking myself out trying to make an analysis every time I come up with something. They give him the credit. Pretty good. And then I realized something. That wasn't Marx. That wasn't Parenti. That was reality. That's what it was. And reality happens to be Marxist. So let's repeat that sentence and go on. Woodrow Wilson is talking. Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers and states, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outraged in the process. Colonies must be obtained or granted in order that no useful corner of the world may be overlooked or left unused. Now that does sound like Marx, the manifesto. The same wording, he said, capitalism goes into every corner of the world to recreate it in its own image and put it to use for its capital accumulation. Interested. Black before the law get to create new opportunities. For instance, in 1990, people started to be populist. They had to become a populist militia to try to get the land back, the land of the to try to get the big companies out of their own. The U.S. declared political instability. That's certain words, the political instability, undemocratic forces, political instability, and of course, racism gets used very handily. You say, these little brown people in this little island have to learn self-governance. So we will have to go down and show them and at least bring law and order and stability back. So they went down, just take care of that. And they stayed a mere 19 years. And they killed 18,000 Haitians. And they also kicked out the French, German, and British companies, and U.S. companies came in. You see, capitalism not only fights the class war against its own neighboring class, capital formation fight against each other and against other national capital formations. And of course, the insider trading. So obviously, refusing to cooperate, refusing to hand over documents. In July of 2002, by November, by October rather, the airwave was filled with war talk. Iraq, war talk, war talk. The Republican Party now reemerged as the party of defense, patriotism, a strong America protecting us from this mortal threat, this imminent danger, Saddam Hussein, who's going to attack us any day with weapons of mass dilution. And they won a midterm election that they should have never won. Along with maintaining superpower status and along with the domestic advantages, another domestic advantage, let me mention, as you know, is making the war against democracy. Because democracy is a real challenge to capitalism. Democracy was a wonderful invention by the people of history. That's what it was under Cleisthenes in ancient Greece in the 5th century, 4th century. That's what it was in Rome in the late 6th century BC, and for 500 years. Democracy was an invention by the people of history, the ordinary working people of history. I wrote a book about it. It's right there, called The Assassination of Julius Caesar, A People's History of Ancient Rome. It was an invention by the people to protect themselves against the abuses of wealth. That's what democracy was. It was born in class struggle. And that's what it still is today. And that's why it's very annoying and very bothersome to the powers that be. And a way to get around it is to circumscribe it, to limit it, to intimidate people, to pass repressive laws, all again under the guise of protecting you and saving you from some terror. And we hear that the terrorists are after us because we're rich, we're prosperous, and we're free. And they hate this about us. But you know what? I've been doing some reading. I read an interview of Osama bin Laden by Robert Fisk in an old issue of The Nation, 1998. I just happened to find it in a pile of materials. And he says, America is the demon and is our enemy. Because they have betrayed us, they've come here, they've destroyed our way, they've undermined us. The guys who tried to blow up the World Trade Center and killed how many, 200 people the first time, remember in 1993, when they went on trial? They said, we attacked you because you won't leave us alone. Because you've come to our country, you've taken our wealth, you've taken our land. That's what they say. They don't say it because, oh, we're just so jealous of you, you got everything, and we got nothing. They say, we just want you to leave us alone. We want you to get your boot off the back of our neck. That's why they do this. So I know the best way we can fight terrorism is by undermining and getting rid of the causes of terrorism, by leaving those people alone and helping them in their popular movement and in their attempt to build a better life, instead of supporting their oppressors and becoming their oppressors. Don't take my word for it. With everything I'm saying here, don't take my word for it. We always say that actions speak louder than words. There are times when words speak louder than actions. When you're trying to decide what is the intent of an action, where the person can't deny the action, but they deny the intent, and they give you another thing. The problem with trying to establish the intent is that nobody's ever seen an intent. arousing of the population to a sense of sacrifice. Once these exist, we have gone a long way on the path to war. I mean, being very positive about these things, good things, clever things, as John Paul tells us. So they come out and they say, I want to read to you one other thing. This was written by a man named Tom Watson. He was a U.S. Senator in 1898. He wasn't a Democrat and he wasn't a Republican. He was a populist. And the populists were a People's Party, especially strong in the South and the West, with a lot of working class support and a lot of poor farmer support. And they'd actually elected a few senators. And they also elected a few governors and some members of the House of Representatives. Watson was a senator this time. In 1898, that's when the U.S. went into this war against Spain to grab Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines and become an empire. But that isn't the story they fed to the people. They said, we got to go in just to help the poor Cubans who were mercilessly treated by the Spaniards. That's why we're doing this. It's because we're so upset about the Cubans and their cotton and their tobacco and their sugar and the Philippines. They never mentioned them. They just went and sent an army and a fleet. Well, the war hype got started, and this is what Watson observed. This is what he wrote. The Spanish War has finished us, the farmers. The blare of the bugles sounds the voice of the reformer. Here's the benefit of the war, said Watson. The bond seekers, the capitalists, the railroads. National bankers will profit by this war. The new bonds give them the basis for new banks, and their power is prolonged. The privileged classes all profit from this war. It takes the attention of the people off economic issues and perpetuates the unjust economic system they have to live under. Politicians profit by the war. The very issues they dare not meet. What do the people get out of this war? The fighting and the taxes. What is the United States doing in this war with Spain in the first place? True, Spain is oppressing Cuba, but so is England oppressing Ireland, Egypt, and India. This is 1898 now. France is oppressing Siam and Madagascar. Turkey is oppressing Armenia. Should we then take up arms against the oppressors of the world? We would more likely end up by becoming oppressors ourselves. The Spaniards and Cubans were bushfighting one another and killing from 3 to 5 men per battle. We've gone down there and killed more people in 3 months than they would have killed in 13 years. If they were sorry for the war, killed. This was the week I was there by Americans. And that stuff kept going on. 3 million were killed in Vietnam. 300,000 Vietnamese are still missing in action. Talk about our missing in action. Vietnam is worth 1,200 now. Where are they? Where should they be? They have 300,000 missing, blown to pieces, gone, whatever. 500,000 in Laos who were killed. And that's not the only victim. There's the victims who survived. There's the victims with shattered bodies, with shattered spirits and minds. There's the victims who lost everything, who spent a lifetime trying to recover from that. 300,000 killed in East Timor by that deranged murder machine known as the Indonesian army, trained, equipped, paid, and advised by the Pentagon, the CIA, and the U.S. National Security State. 80,000 killed in El Salvador. Finally acknowledged, and the New York Times acknowledged, 30 years later, acknowledged that 205,000 were killed in Guatemala. And the president, our fearless leader of that time, slimebag Bill Clinton, goes down and says, I apologize. Oh, okay, well, he apologized. That makes it all okay now. 205,000 killed by death squads, by extermination programs. 600 Mayan villages. 600 of these villages, every man, woman, and child of them killed by Rios Montt, General Rios Montt, protege of the School of the Americas, protege of the CIA. Over 1 million people killed in Mozambique. We never heard a word about this in the media because it was the CIA war. Over 2 million killed in Angola in a war that went on for 30 years, which didn't have to go on at all, except that UNITA was equipped and financed by the U.S. All through the Middle East, popular movements, workers' movements, unions, student movements, farmer collectives, all of them destroyed, shattered, battered down in Turkey, in Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon. Saudi Arabia, that obscenely filthy, rich, corrupt family wouldn't last 3 weeks if they didn't have U.S. guns behind them. People of Saudi Arabia ready to get rid of them. And we could go on. 21 countries in Africa that had enormous amounts of U.S. arms, bribes, all of this, to put in the most retrograde, repressive, and corrupt rulers to destroy every popular movement, every democratic movement that emerges. These people are perfectly capable of democracy. These people are perfectly capable of viable production. These people are perfectly capable of organizing their markets and their labor. They're perfectly capable. They aren't allowed to do it because of this kind of destruction. The destruction of the economic infrastructure, the impoverishment of the people, the destruction of their future. Kill the future of a nation too. And anyone who dares to oppose it or question it is called the rogue state. And there's no rogue state. There's no terrorist movement. There's no axis of evil. There's no communist state that has this kind of record. There's no communist, red blood menace, say what you want, Stalinist state that has anything like this record of aggression and destruction and murder and violation of international law. There just isn't. And I say, American people don't know it. All of this, by the way, is a matter of public record. It's not like I got some secret documents that just came into my hands that no one else has seen. It's all a matter of public record. But of course, there's some parts of the public record that get blasted across the media, and there are other parts of it that are thoroughly suppressed. Now, it's not enough to bemoan or denounce this. We also have to explain it. We have to explain why. Why is this happening? We will not convince our compatriots of the wrongful nature of this kind of policy unless we discuss the real intent and interest behind such policy. As long as they believe that this is being done to protect them from some threats out there, they will go along with it. They don't care if their leaders are rough. They don't care if their leaders violate international law. They want them to violate international law. They want them to act like thugs and gangsters. They want them to be tough and brutal and total decisive. That's called strong leadership. That's called strong defense. And when they are afraid, and that is what our leadership has done, is to conjure up fears that there's people out there communists. The communists are going to get you. This is all because of communists. We have to do this. We have to support dictators because we got to stop those communists. But a lot of these interventions came way before communism, and a lot more of them are happening more frequently, more bloodily after communism. So it wasn't communism. That was one of the excuses. That was one of the bugaboos that they raised up. That was one of the fears they conjured up so that people will rally around the flag and will do what the leaders want. And we've got to speak to that fear and say, you have a false fear. There are things you really should be afraid of and you're not afraid of them, like poisoning the environment, like going and killing all these people, like putting your democracy at risk, like having your public treasure devoured by a rapacious military and a rapacious corporate America. Those are real things you should fear, and stop fearing some little country. One year it's Noriega, the next year it's Milosevic, the next year it's Gaddafi, the next year it's the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the next year it's Saddam Hussein. Remember Gaddafi? I remember 1980s. In the 1980s, I was going around lecturing, and suddenly I hear people saying to me, Gaddafi, Gaddafi. Everybody was Gaddafi. Gaddafi. What about Gaddafi? Gaddafi, Gaddafi, Gaddafi gonna get your mama, Gaddafi. Who's Gaddafi? I said, what Gaddafi? What? 2 months ago you couldn't have found Libya on the map. Today you're convinced that this guy, head of a country of 3 million people, with an army of 50,000, about the size of the LAPD, is a mortal threat to the safety of the United States of America, to the national security. And what was Gaddafi's real sin? I'll tell you what his real sin was, because that policy wasn't stupid when they targeted Gaddafi. And their animosity toward him is very cynical. Here's what Gaddafi did. Gaddafi took a country that had a social structure like Saudi Arabia, where a few obscenely rich families ran the whole thing, got all the money from the oil, and the mass of people were poor. And what he did is he kicked those families out. He and his colonels kept colonel rebellion. And he started a forestation program. He planted millions of trees. He started programs, education school programs. For the first time in the history, the ordinary Libyans could go to school. That's what he was doing. And he nationalized the oil industry. And he took the earnings. He took the earnings from the oil industry. He still sold it to the Western markets. What are they going to do with it? They can't drink it. They can't eat it. Should they have? More than happy to sell it to the West. But they were getting the cut on it. And that money is what he used. And he gave that back to the people. And that's not what they like. Because the difference between the haves and the have-nots, I mean, the truth is, the conflict between the haves and the have-nots, the haves are really the have-it-all. They want it all. And they don't want to give a little bit here and a little there. The U.S. government since World War II has given away $300 billion in military aid. Just think about $300 billion. That could solve all the budgetary crises of all the states in the Union right now. Just that amount. Aid to train, equip, and subsidize 2.5 million troops and internal security forces in more than 80 countries. Not to defend these nations from outside invasion, but to protect ruling oligarchs and multinational corporate investors from the dangers of domestic anti-capitalist insurgency. How do we know that's true? Well, by observing, for instance, that with very few exceptions, there's no evidence that these various regimes have ever been threatened by attacks from neighboring countries. So why are they building up these military forces? Why are they building up these security and police and paramilitary forces? It's not to make war or defend themselves from another country that's going to make war on them. It's to make war on their own people, make war on their own working people. That's why. Protect those countries, make the world safe for the Fortune 500. We also know that that's true because these friendly regimes invariably support economic systems that are subserviently integrated into a global system of process and enrichment of the few, as opposed to those who think all those things are there for the needs and the social betterment of the many. And that's the basic struggle that goes on. The designated enemy, the demonized enemy, pumped up by the media, obligingly following the line of the White House or the Pentagon puts out. The designated enemy can be a reformist, populist military government, as in Panama under Torrijos and even under Noriega, or as in Egypt under Nasser, Peru under Velasco, Portugal after Salazar, of the army officers of Cuba. It could be a Christian socialist government as in Nicaragua under Sandinista. It could be a social democracy popular front government as in Chile under Allende, or Jamaica under Michael Manley, or Greece under Papandreou, or the Dominican Republic under Juan Bosch. It could be a Marxist-Leninist government as in Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea, an Islamic revolutionary order as in Libya under Gaddafi, or even a conservative militarist regime as in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Now these guys don't quite have it just the way they want it. Having said all this, they got really surprised and very seriously shaken up last January, February, December, January, February. You see, George Bush got a free ride into Afghanistan because of 9/11. There were some of us who did demonstrate against that war, but he really pretty much got what he wanted. He was fighting terrorism. He was supposed to have gotten the Taliban. He said the most single important thing is to get this Osama bin Laden, this demonized individual. When he couldn't find him, he said, it's not important at all, doesn't matter. Now they expected the very same thing the next year, and that didn't happen. Rather extraordinary things began to happen, and there were people in this room who played a good role in making that happen. Hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of people began to voice their objection and demonstrating all over the United States. Not just about the ones we heard about in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., but in L.A. and Seattle, in places all around the country. All over the world, people were demonstrating. In London, 2 million people, the largest demonstration in English history. In Spain, 81% of the people against the war. In Madrid, in every city, in every town, every night. Spain, nothing starts till about 10 at night. There are civilized people out there every night demonstrating against this war for weeks on end. In Italy, 78% of the people against the war. In Greece, 90-something% of the people against the war. Demonstrations in every one of these countries. In Germany, Germans against the war. Even the Germans. Finland, in Lithuania, in Indonesia, in Argentina, in Nigeria. In Mexico, Vicente Fox just aching to be another lapdog for the American president. Couldn't do it, right? Because all of Mexico is against that war. In Japan, big demonstrations in Osaka, Kyoto, Tokyo against the war. Indonesia, we go on and on. All over the world, coordinated actions like this. This shook the hell out of the White House. These guys were really, they dropped that stuff about shock and awe. We're gonna blow hit everything, and just the ones we don't kill will be left vegetables, and we'll just stroll in. Then they dropped that, and they said this is all for democracy, this is all for liberation. See, and they've had to hold to that line. And today now they're caught in a people's resistance. They're subjected to something like anywhere from 10 to 20 attacks a day. They're losing, according to the U.S. commander, 3 to 6 men with 40 seriously wounded every week. They're in a war, a people's war now, and they could do real counterinsurgency, and they're doing something. They're killing a lot of Iraqis. They're rounding people up and they're shooting them. But they also can't quite do that. They have to keep this pretense that we're here as liberators, not occupiers. what? As if they were watching a goddamn basketball game or something. But now he turns around and goes to the UN and asks them to help pick up the blood tab. Pick up some of the blood on this and pick up some of the financial costs. And the UN is saying, that's very interesting. Very interesting. You know he's lost political control when Kofi Annan, who jumps to anything the U.S. wants, who spends his whole life, yes, U.S., oh, yes, yes, yes. When Kofi Annan turns around and says, hey, this is the United Nations, we're not going to get into this kind of stuff. Go in, come in with us, but as an advisory role, and the U.S. calls all the shots. So it's how can you push an offer like that? And he says, we refuse. Kofi Annan said, we refuse. Because the people of the world have refused. The people of the world are making themselves heard. And that's the important thing. That the people of the world make themselves heard, that we fight, that we struggle, that we go at this thing, that we don't compromise, we don't give up, we don't get discouraged, we just keep going. Well, some people say to me, well, you got a conspiracy theory. Really? What is that? You get this? Usually people tend to do this deliberately. I said, no, they're just sleepwalkers. They just happen to they throw a dart at the map and say, well, let's attack Iraq. Yeah, I said, or let's attack this country. Of course they plan. Of course they plan. I mean, you really think there's a group of men sitting around in a room? Somehow that image really goes now. Sitting around in a room and planning this? I said, oh, no, they're not sitting around in a room. They're meeting on carousels, and they're talking like that, and or they're skydiving, and they're holding hands saying, yeah, we're going to do this, get a new Uruguay round, and increase the military budget, and increase our profits, and all that. Yeah, of course they sit around a room. Where the hell else do you think they're going to sit around? They got plenty of rooms in the White House. They got plenty of rooms at the Council of Foreign Relations. They got plenty of rooms at the Bilderberg Conference. They got plenty of rooms at the Knickerbocker Club in New York, at the Bohemian Grove, and the Bohemian Club in San Francisco. Back in 1991, I looked at the Bilderberg Conference attendees. They meet every, 2-3 years, named after Bilderberg, the hotel where they first met. These are the ruling elite leaders, political, economic, corporate leaders, with a few top media people and a few great professors to write imposition papers for them. Few little lackey hired prostitutes. Apology to the prostitutes who are working girls who have a choice. And I'm looking at this 1990, and so I saw this big stack, and so immediately, of course, I turned to the United States. I want to see from the United States, went to the Bilderberg Conference. The first name is no surprise. David Rockefeller of Rockefeller Brothers Association. Aren't you glad you got representation here at these world conferences? They're protecting our interests here, right? The second name really puzzled me and surprised me. I had heard of him, and I know he sent his National Guard down to Guatemala, and seemed like one of those governors who was cozy with the CIA or something, but I knew nothing about him. It said, the Honorable Bill Clinton, Governor of Arkansas. I said, what the hell is the Governor of Arkansas doing, rubbing shoulders and holding hands with David Rockefeller? And then 6 months later, I found out he was suddenly in the media as the front-runner Democratic candidate for President of the United States. He was the guy who was able to get WTO to pass a Democratic Congress. So of course they plan, of course they are always planning, and we too have to organize and we have to plan. So remember that the empire achieves its goals by consuming the resources of the republic. The empire achieves its power by devouring the liberties of the republic. So the fight we face now, the struggle against U.S. globalism, is a struggle for the heart and soul of democracy itself. Thank you for your kind attention. Many of them thought that they could keep all the securities of communism and overlay it with capitalist consumerism. They thought that if they were laid off from work, if their factory was privatized, the government was going to find them another job. You talk to Polish workers, they just assumed that everything they had was going to stay, and they were going to get this other whole new thing. They didn't get it. Now they're getting it. Boy, are they getting it right up the kazoo. 89-91 period of overthrow and imposition, there were opinion polls in Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Russia, and East Germany. And these were reported in the U.S. press that showed that most people still opted for state ownership or some modified form of socialism. The numbers who actually wanted free market capitalism were surprisingly small. When anti-communist governments took power in Russia and Eastern Europe, they set about suppressing the communist and socialist left in the name of democratic reform. In late 1993, facing resistance to his free market policies, Boris Yeltsin forcibly disbanded the Russian parliament and every other elected representative body in the country, including all the regional and city councils. He abolished Russia's constitutional court and launched an armed attack upon the parliamentary building, killing hundreds of resistors. Estimates are about 3,000 actually, and demonstrators. Thousands were rounded up and detained. Opposition leaders were jailed without trial. Hundreds of elected and appointed officials were placed under investigation. Some are still in jail. Yeltsin banned labor unions from all political activities. He suppressed dozens of publications and television shows. He exercised monopoly control over all broadcast media. He outlawed 15 political parties. He rewrote the Constitution, giving the executive nearly absolute power over legislation. For these crimes, he was treated as a defender of democracy and reform by U.S. leaders and the media. What they most liked about Yeltsin was, to quote the San Francisco Chronicle, quote, he has never wavered in his support for privatization of state-owned industries. I think that really says it all. In the various Eastern European countries, Marxists were purged from all public employment. Communist Party assets acquired and paid for by party members were arbitrarily confiscated. The same in Germany, in Russia, in the Czech Republic. Václav Havel seized the properties of the Socialist Union of Youth. These included campsites, recreation halls, and cultural and scientific facilities for children. These were liquidated and put under the management of joint stock companies at the expense of the youth who were left to roam the streets. In Russia, Boris Yeltsin twice suspended the Communist Party newspaper Pravda. He eventually turned the party's 12-story building and its press over to a pro-Yeltsin government newspaper that became the full owner.
Oh,
Yeltsin's police continued to attack political demonstrators in Moscow and other cities. Two parliamentary deputies,
sitting
one
here
independent, the other communist,
doing the exercise with no timer.
government were assassinated. In 1994, journalist
Like a dummy.
Dmitry Kolodov, who was probing corruption in high places, was assassinated. Reactionary, anti-Semitic, crypto-fascist parties and hate campaigns have surfaced in former communist countries, along with the desecration of Jewish cemeteries and xenophobic attacks against foreigners of darker hue. Like Valenza, quote, a gang of Jews got hold of the trough and is bent on destroying us, unquote. Later on, Lech Wałęsa said he was misinterpreted. He did not mean all Jews, only the greedy ones. I remember how many people on the left adored Lech Wałęsa, a worker hero who was going to bring true socialism. Yeah, right. Mercenary armies, destruction of the productive facilities of society, more invasion, more sabotage, economic boycott, economic embargo, monetary embargo, technological embargo, would have distorting effects upon a society. In May of 1921, Lenin got up before the Bolshevik Party convention and he said, we've had enough of the workers' opposition. Let's get rid of them. Now the workers' opposition were loyal Bolsheviks. They were communists. They were in the Bolshevik Party. They were in the Communist Party. When the Kronstadt Rebellion came, the workers' opposition did not side with the Kronstadt sailors. They sided with the party. In the Civil War, they were with the party. Throughout all the struggles, the workers' opposition were with the party. But they had formed a self-conscious caucus that had decided that it would represent the particular interests of the industrial proletariat against the party itself at times. And after all this invasion, all this destruction, all this terrible death and struggle, where Lenin once said Soviet Russia is like a man with a death fever just hanging on by an inch of his life. After all that, Lenin turned and said, we've had enough opposition. The feeling very much was that that opposition was a wedge, an opening. It invited our enemies, our mortal enemies, to dividers. And the party convention uproariously supported him and said, no more workers' opposition, no more factions in the party. So right there, that emphasis on a monolithic party. And by the way, that same month, or the month before, in April, Lenin called for a strengthening of the trade unions and for more worker representation on the Central Committee of the Communist Party. So it wasn't that he was moving anti-worker, it was that he was moving against opposition. So right there you see the seeds, of a system that could not develop naturally with an opposition, with checks, with internal debate and argument. A system that began to strain for uniformity, for siege, for lockstep cooperation, the emphasis being on organizing, getting the thing done, stop asking too many questions because everything was a life and death issue. When the Sandinistas came to power in Nicaragua 10 years ago, filled with ideals and hopes for their nation and their people, they discovered a very awful thing. And it wasn't about themselves, even though they had to do it to themselves. It was about that capitalist encirclement. They discovered that they needed a secret police. They discovered that they needed a security police. Because all around them, coming in from two borders and within their own society, were acts of sabotage, espionage, attack, mercenary invasion, and the like. And they understood that if the revolution was going to survive, they would have to build up instruments of state power, instruments of coercion even. And these instruments, by the way, can make mistakes. And these instruments can not only make mistakes, they can commit serious crimes. Although in Nicaragua, the impressive record is how few crimes there were, given the utterly dire conditions they were under. So that kind of, that capitalist encirclement, which goes on, unrelenting, attacking any existing socialist, communist, you don't want to call, by the way, some of you don't want to call those societies socialist, don't call them socialist, call them window shades or camels, whatever you want to call them, as long as you know what I mean, that I mean the public ownership of the means of production, using capital in a different way, not for capital accumulation per se as an end in itself, a strong social wage, free education, free medical care, and subsidized housing, subsidized food, subsidized bread, all those things that the Hungarians and Poles are now complaining about losing. That's what I mean by socialism. If you don't want to call that socialism, that's not what real socialism is. Something that's going to exist someday when the world and people are better, different, and it's going to come down and be in a much better form than those things were. That's fine. But in this world, see, I believe socialism is not that real, beautiful goal, that societal participation, harmony, this and that. I believe that socialism is a process of struggle to achieve that thing. So just go along with my vocabulary if you have trouble, even if you have trouble with it. Those socialist or communist societies suffered terrible distorting effects. If there had been no invasion, if there had been no espionage, if there had been no attack, if there had been no White Guard army burning villages, there wouldn't have been a Red Army of that size. There wouldn't have been a Stalin, there wouldn't have been a KGB. If there hadn't been a CIA, there wouldn't have been a KGB. If there hadn't been a NATO encirclement, there wouldn't have been a Warsaw Pact. And to lose sight of that fact is to lose sight of an essential force of what was going on over those 70 years. Or 10 years. And if you want to know what the Soviet Union went through in its early years, just look at what Nicaragua went through in these 10 years. And then multiply that by 10. Every single one of those countries was targeted. They were targeted by missiles. They were targeted by acts of espionage. They were targeted by, as I say, an economic embargo and all sorts of other forms of aggression. They were targeted by incredible propaganda barrages and the like. Unrelenting, unrelenting. The most targeted socialist country in the world, as of a couple years ago, and actually still to today, is not Nicaragua, was not Nicaragua. Not even Cuba. It was the Soviet Union. All those missiles were pointing to the USSR. They still are. And they're still building those missiles. And they're refusing to negotiate those missiles into sea-based missiles, which is where the U.S. has 75% of its first strike force. They have announced that they will not negotiate that 75% of the first strike force, only their 25%, which is land-based. And the Soviets, of course, 75% of their force is land-based, and only 25% is sea-based. And none of it's working very well
leave stuff in our pockets when we know it needs to be washed because this bitch came out the dryer hot and ready like Caesar's little ass and burnt my hand.
You okay?
Made me very mad. I'm now very angry.
Sorry, are you injured?
We're not going to be like Mr. Albert Jackson and leave stuff in our pockets and have them in the washing machine. The man had phones, wallets, hella money. Pissed my mama off. I'm going to be like
Nobody ever talked about that, but they assumed that that's what they were going to have. They took for granted those things they had. And they are looking now for the goodies. And the East Germans, by the way, were stunned last year. I mean, before the border opened and all this stuff happened, when something like 800 of their doctors applied to emigrate. Because their doctors do have the goodies. They have a little apartment, a nice apartment. They have a car. They have phones. They have all these other things. They have a very good income and all that. And these doctors were applying to emigrate. And the government was really stunned, saying, why? Why do? And the answer is they want to see Paris. They want to travel. And they don't have any hard currency. By the way, there wasn't such a restriction on travel. Klaus said people could travel. Getting out of the country wasn't hard. You didn't have any hard currency because of the exchange, because of the monetary embargo against East German currency. And so you'd have to go to West Germany, stay with a relative. You'd have only $10 in your pocket, and you could stay only limited time and all that. They want to go elsewhere. They want to do all the things that are being done elsewhere. So the dynamic is that as people get treated better, they also want more. They're not necessarily grateful for what they have. They want more. In fact, they take for granted what they have. Lawrence Wexler, in his an article in the New Yorker, was interviewing some Polish workers, and he said, well, if this factory, would you be in favor of this factory being turned over to private hands, and then it would work more efficiently under private ownership, because they would fire a lot of the feather bedding, surplus workers. And they said, yes, that would be good. Be more productive than per worker. And they said, well, what if you two lost your jobs? And they said, well, that's okay. We still do it. You'd still do it? Yes, because the government would find us other jobs. And Wexler said, they don't get it. They don't get it. They don't understand that social wage, those securities, those built-in safety nets and all that are going to go because you're getting this other system, that dynamic system of capital penetration and capital accumulation where you become an instrumental value for this other end. You are no longer the end. We no longer worry about getting everybody a job here. We worry about who are the people we can pick. The younger workers. Wexler talking about the older, tired worker. If he's too slow, the owner, by the way, a former Solidarity leader, comes along and fires him on the spot to leave. And none of the other workers don't even look up with their heads. He's fired. The Poles now are taking abuses from their new capitalist solidarity government that they would have never tolerated under the communist government. And they say it's okay because it's going to lead us to the promised land soon. And what they're suffering now is a 600% inflation, 100,000 unemployed every month, 100,000, hunger, bread lines in Poland. By the way, an incredible story, which isn't being reported very much. I don't see it on the evening news. Have I missed it? Shots of the bread lines, the place and all that. But nothing much. It's a sensational, eye-opening story. The system that didn't work is out, and the system that does work has come in and it's brought massive unemployment and inflation. That's the system that works. That's the success story. And that's the problem. Because the Poles, when they're thinking of capitalism, are not thinking of Zaire and capitalist Indonesia and capitalist Brazil and capitalist Mexico and capitalist Turkey. They're thinking of West Germany, Sweden, Canada, the U.S. That's what they think they're going to become. But they're not going to become that. They're becoming, right before our very eyes this year, they're becoming another Brazil or Mexico or Turkey. Well, this is what we face. I can go on with other points I want to make about what was wrong with existing socialism. But I think I'll stop here. Any leadership that didn't suffer so much from despotism as the Aryan leadership that talked almost to each other mine was in Cuba and talking to people there, and he had a young man say to him, "You Americans live well, don't tell me. I see it on your television, your Miami television. I watch Dynasty in Dallas, and I see how you live. Right? We all go home and tell this to our butlers and our maids on our estates. So as they do in Dynasty. That cultural penetration, by the way, not just Eastern Europe and socialist countries, all through the third world, this myth that America is a place of limitless bounty, that anybody in America could live well if he just wishes so and is willing to work, and then you will live well. That still is the religion of Eastern Europe, of existing socialist countries, of the Soviet Union, and of most of the third world. Even though they hate the Yankees and want them out of their own country, there are many people who tomorrow come here. You talk about the refugees from communism, the refugees from capitalism. If you open your doors to Latin America and said, "Anybody come, my troubled people, come, we'll let you in." Let me tell you something about the refugees from capitalism. For those who think that capitalism is triumphant throughout the world. In Italy, there's a movement called the Democratic Movement of the Unemployed in Naples. Now, Italy, as capitalist countries go, isn't that bad. In some social democracy, there's a social party, there's a communist party, they've won some benefit. So by many standards, Italy isn't so bad. Now, this is one of the better capitalist countries. They went to the Cuban embassy in Rome. The request was addressed to Cuban President Fidel Castro. It said, quote, "We have found it impossible to live an honest, decent life in our own country. Permit us, therefore, to ask for political asylum because we are fully convinced that we will find in Cuba not only social justice, but also a little peace and quiet." All the same, the movement also presented an appeal to all the parties in the Italian Chamber of Deputies, which is the lower house, asking them to put pressure on the government, which continues to remain deaf to the appeals of the group about the grave problems facing unemployed young people in Naples. So right in the middle of all this, now here's an interesting, unusual story. Don't you think the media would have had something on this? Well, in the midst of everybody east wanting to come west, there are some people west who want to go east. Let's look at this for a minute. What does that mean? I could do the show, but I guess Tom Brokaw, that little twerp, can't do it. Well, what I say by that example is, let's discard the myth that capitalism is triumphant, that capitalism has solved the problems of its people, that it's giving its people a good life, that it's giving the globe a good chance of survival, because none of those things are true. And if none of those things are true about capitalism, then a lot of the things that Marxists say are true. And that means that we've got to keep fighting and keep struggling and keep doing the things we're doing to try to change this awful, inhuman system today, to bring humanity to it, to bring justice to it, and to bring democracy, real democracy to it. Thank you. About that. We need change. We need to tax the rich and not the poor. We need to restructure the use of energy to save the environment and ourselves. We need less hogwash about affirmative action. Because all the publicity given to affirmative action has convinced all sorts of people that women and people of color are looking for special treatment. Always be suspicious of an issue when the media gives it a lot of attention. Because we know that affirmative action isn't the problem. The truth is the real problem in this country is the persistent and virulent racism and sexism in training, recruitment, hiring, job evaluation, wages, salaries, and personal relations. And that's the struggle for equality, not for some special treatment. We need a health insurance program for the 35 million Americans who are not covered. I mean, isn't that amazing? Isn't it time for an investigation? How could that be? How did that come about? Why? We need people who not only bemoan these things, like the liberals say, isn't it a shame the homeless? Isn't it a shame not enough adequate health care? Isn't it a shame? You have to stop complaining about that. You have to start asking, but why does that exist? What are the forces that allow in the richest country in the world these kinds of terrible inhumanities and inequalities? And not just national health insurance. We need a national health program for everyone. We need some relief from the evasive, fatuous, mealy-mouthed, know-it-all anti-communist media pundits and conservative columnists. The gas bags who sit there say, well, Bob, what do you think? Well, I thought his delivery was very good. He seemed calm. He had a good rapport with the audience, and he used that one thing very effectively. Yes, he did. He ran into a little trouble. On the other hand, Senator Thone seemed to not quite have it together today. He seemed like he probably tired because he's been on the road so long. Yes, I think that's what it was. And I'm sitting there and saying, what the hell I gotta hear this for? What is this, theater critic stuff? They don't talk about the issue. They talk about process. In fact, they talk about talking about process. The airways of this country, ladies and gentlemen, are the property of the people of the United States. That may come as a surprise to some network bosses, but it's true. And those airways should be opened up. There should be public access television. We need exposure to a socialist perspective. We need exposure to various dissident perspectives in the mainstream media. Not just, as I say, ideas are mediated through a social structure, and some of them get the mass market, and some of them are left for very small and select audiences. And we need discussion of worker-controlled enterprises and public ownership. We need a national debate in the mainstream media on the oppressive, unjust purposes of U.S. foreign policy in the third world and elsewhere. We need to re-examine our institutions, our schools, our colleges, hospitals, museums. We've got to find out why all those institutions, our media, why they are all dominated by self-selected boards of trustees or regents who are answerable to no one but themselves and who control all spending, all hiring, all other policies. We need a government that has the capacity to go directly into not-for-profit production. If private industry can't provide the needs of the people, if the utilities can't give you electricity without jacking up the rates every year, jacking it up again and again, then take it away from the utilities and the people themselves can do it themselves. If private industry can't build us homes and hospitals and get jobs, then let the public sector do it. There's all these people who need work. There's all this work that needs to be done. There's all this capital that can be used to do it, and none of it comes together because there's no profit in it for the Morgans and the Rockefellers and the DuPonts. So then let the public sector do it, not for profit, and it will get done. And when it gets done, it creates social income, it creates private income, it expands your tax base, it creates public income, and it creates more opportunities for growth. The danger with that, the danger is not that it won't work, the danger is that it does work. And that's why they stop it. That's why they want privatization. That's why they sell off Conrail at one-third its actual value, because Conrail under public ownership was working, and those railroads under private ownership were milked like cows, milked and run down, and then they turn around to the government, they turn around to the taxpayer, and then they go socialist after they milked it down and it's about to fall apart, and they say, we can't run it anymore. You're going to have to take it over. And the taxpayers take it over, and they dig deeper into their pockets, and they pay for it, and they put it back on a working basis, a rational basis, a not-for-profit basis, so that the money it makes goes back into it and doesn't go out to the George Bushes and the Ronald Reagans and their class. And then when it works, Ronald Reagan said, we got to sell this thing. And he sells it not because it wasn't working, but because it does work. We need to open up our political system, ladies and gentlemen. We need to have new parties, not just two capitalist parties, not just two anti-communist parties, not just one party that's red-based and liberal-based, and another party that lives in fear of being red-baited and liberal-baited. We need to do what the Sandinistas in Nicaragua have done, which is have proportional representation, so that if a minority party wins 11% of the vote in Nicaragua, it gets 11% of the seats in the National Assembly. They don't tell you that in the media. Ronald Reagan hasn't dwelled on that fact, has he? That the Sandinistas have done. We need funding for minority parties. We need free TV time for minority parties. Conservatives palm themselves off as being more patriotic than liberals. Liberals think they're more patriotic than socialists and others on the left. But we on the left are second to no one in our patriotism. We want perestroika. We want fundamental restructuring and democratization of overseas and domestic policies. We want a restructuring and democratization of the political process, the values, institutions, the economy, and the class power of this country. We real patriots say, along with Albert Camus, I want to love my country and justice too. And in fact, I believe that the only way you can be a real patriot is to love justice. Because you can't be patriotic to something that's unjust. We want to spend less time trying to save the world with bombers and battleships and more time healing ourselves. This is not just a good idea or a noble pronouncement. It is a historical necessity. This country does not belong to Ronald Reagan and his billionaire friends, although they act like it does. It belongs to us, and sooner or later we will take it back. Thank you. does win it. He goes into Vietnam and he kills a battalion of Russians. He kills the whole Vietnamese army. They throw napalm at him. He's captured by them. He's tortured, and he liberates prisoners of war. He's aided by the fact that his adversaries all seem to be legally blind. They cannot shoot straight. Hundreds of rounds are shot at him, and they just always miss. Never fluff his hair. But while the movie is outrageous and it's ridiculous, again, don't lose sight of the fact that it's once more turning history on its head. I mean, in reality, the Vietnamese have exchanged prisoners of war with the United States after signing the Paris Peace Agreement, which ended the war. And that whole POW-MIA issue is really an outrageous, pandering exploitation of the unrealistic hopes of those families, conducted by the Pentagon and the U.S. government, and played upon by people like Ronald Reagan. You know, there were 18,000 Americans missing in action from World War II. Where do you suppose they are? Are they being held captive in Toyota factories or in beer cellars in Wiesbaden someplace or something? No, tragically, unfortunately, sadly, they're dead, and it's acknowledged that they're dead. But the 2,000-some missing from Vietnam have never been acknowledged realistically for what they are, which is that they're dead. Instead, that issue is exploited. It's not only exploited, but whole movies are made out of it. Not just Rambo 2, but Missing in Action 1, Missing in Action 2, Missing in Action 3, Bradford Missing in Action 4, I think is coming up soon. Second, U.S. prisoners of war were not tortured by the Soviets in Vietnam, as depicted in this film. They have Rambo being tortured by Russians. There is no historical record of that. There is, however, a record of South Vietnamese trained forces and U.S. special forces using all sorts of torture, electric shock, water treatment tortures on National Liberation Force fighters. Third, the Soviets did not drop napalm on anyone in Vietnam. You know who dropped the napalm in Vietnam? Just complete turnaround. The U.S. dropped huge amounts of napalm and Agent Orange, something like 20% of the land. The whole food chain in Vietnam has been tainted. Vietnam was a country that had no liver cancer. It was an unknown disease because people ate sensible food like rice, grains, and vegetables. And today it has one of the highest rates of liver cancer in the world because of what we did to their ecology chain. That's not what you get in the film. I guess you can get that kind of line from somebody like Sylvester Stallone. If he could portray himself as a fearless war hero, even though he spent the Vietnam era working in a private girls' school in Europe, why would we expect him to play straight with the larger history, right? Rambo 3, Rambo is in Afghanistan now. And the Soviets are portrayed as sadists, rapists, and torturers who murder little children with explosive toys. A horror story that originated, propagated by the CIA, for which there's no evidence. The Red Army got better things to do than put toys down to blow up kids' fingers. For fun, good old Rambo sends a Soviet captive plummeting, puts a noose around his neck, and he throws him off a cave shaft down to his death. And then for still more fun, Rambo dynamites him, blows him up, he had him rigged up, and he sets him off. What a guy, that Rambo. He gets along real swell with the Mujahideen killers, the feudal landowners, the Islamic fanatics, and the opium growers, the guys who took up guns when the Kabul government said that their women could take the veils off, and their women could go to school, and their children could go to school. They took up guns. They're laughably described as the Afghan freedom fighters. Those of you who supported them, I hope you continue to support and watch how they operate and what they stand for. Let me say that Rambo gets along real well with them. By the end of this third and worst of the Rambo films, our hero has sort of mellowed out a little and gives his good luck charm to an adoring 12-year-old Afghan boy soldier who himself is shown killing Russians on several occasions. War is a kind of a healing, nurturing experience for Rambo. You know, in Rambo 1, which I didn't mention, he was a borderline psychotic. He got into all sorts of trouble. He was a Vietnam veteran who was just psyched and freaked out. By the end of Rambo 3, all this violence has kind of put him together. He's found himself. As the movie ends, you feel he's going to move on, maybe head back to the States, buy a trailer, hunt bear, settle down maybe, you know, get married, open up a nice little gun shop in Texas. Get married, I don't know about get married, because women don't figure in the Rambo movies. As a matter of fact, Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there to be carved out and be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. The capitalist European and North American powers have carved out and taken the timber, the flax, the hemp, the cocoa, the rum, the tin, the copper, the iron, the rubber, the bauxite, the slaves, and the cheap labor. They have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
Oh my God, come on, Cass.
And I said to the Cappuccino, I said, "You like Fidel?" He said, "Sí, sí, with all her soul." of the Third World, a process that's been going on for about 400 years, perpetrated by the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Dutch, the Belgians, the French, the English, and most recently, most successfully, most impressively, by the Americans. That is, that is by the ruling classes of each country, not by the ordinary people. The ordinary people simply paid the cost of empire. The ordinary people simply sent their sons off to die on the plains of India or in the jungles of the Congo or in Latin America, wherever else. But that expropriation of the Third World has been going on for